So good morning, good afternoon. So we have a few attendants trickling in. We have a pretty international attending group here, which is exciting. We've got North America, Europe, and I believe someone from Latin America joining. So hope you're all having a wonderful day and staying happy and healthy. Before I kick off, just want to thank everyone for their time. Obviously, everyone has busy schedules and it's different time zones. So really appreciate you carving out about 60 minutes for us today. A couple introductions before we kick off. So my name is Graham Monroe. I'm calling in from just outside of Toronto in Prince Edward County, which is a little wine region, a couple hours outside of the city. I have a little summer house there, and I'm currently sitting in my daughter's bedroom, hence the unicorns and pink. That's not my decor, but I appreciate it nonetheless. Just a bit of background. So on me, and then I'll introduce Jeremy. So I started my career as a software developer. I went out to university in British Columbia, Canada, got a comp sci degree and started coding for Motorola, and then eventually moved over to Nokia, very different cultures, Nokia being a Finnish company. Ended up moving into product management at Nokia, and that was my first taste of product, and I had a variety of roles there. And then moved over to Toronto, where I joined a startup in the content marketing space. And it was at that startup called SyncApps where I had the insight to start my own company, which was Flashstock, which I founded in 2013. At Flashstock, it was all about helping big brands create content using a software platform and a global network of creators. It's there where I met Jeremy. Jeremy was one of the first few hires. He came in as a salesperson with his background at CPG from L'Oreal and IBM. He was a great fit. And then eventually migrated, after building out the sales team, migrated over to product, where he ran the product group for quite a long time. And then in 2017, we were about 150 people at Flashstock. We got acquired by Shutterstock. So for those of you who don't know, Shutterstock is a big public stock photo provider. They acquired us as an additional product to their multiple product lines. And then both Jeremy and I left around the same time. And so that sort of brings us to today. So, when we left, we spent a lot of time talking about product and our experience in product, both, primarily at Flashstock, but also at Shutterstock. And we kind of always both felt that it was too much focused on delivery, product at either of those organizations. And obviously I was running one of those organizations, so it was very much my responsibility, was very delivery focused in the sense that sort of validating concepts and bringing those concepts to life wasn't necessarily forward thinking in terms of their hypothesis, in terms of how we can bring the product forward. And then when we went over to Shutterstock, it was very, very similar. Shutterstock, it was actually a bit worse because Shutterstock is such a successful company that I think the product group somewhat rested on their laurels. And Jeremy and I, both loving product and loving tech, realized that product would be a big part of our future. And so we wanted to learn more about how it's working today, specifically within software, and realized that the best way to learn is by talking to a bunch of really smart people who are doing it every single day. And so we decided to kick off a pretty independent research project where we set out a goal of chatting with 50 heads of product, chief product officers, VP product, to try to really understand how they work, where they struggled, what were some of the challenges, and what are some of the things that they did. And so we did that. And so today we are presenting our findings in a very, very informal roundtable format. So in terms of agenda, we've got about, just doing a time check, we've got about 52 minutes left together. I will spend a brief amount of time, as brief as possible, going into some of the high-level themes on the research, how we did the research, what we learned, and then hopefully spend the bulk of the time chatting with the people in the trenches actually doing the work. So we've got three fantastic guests today, which I'll introduce during the roundtable discussion. And what's interesting is a lot of the conversations I had with our guest is actually hit a lot of those themes. So it'll be a nice closure. And then if there's time, we will do a Q&A. And so this is my first time hosting a virtual roundtable. So we're going to use the chat. So if you have questions at any point throughout the presentation, you can chat them in Zoom, and then we'll try to address them at the end. And if we don't, we'll send some notes. Because we're sort of doing this as a passion project, we'd love your feedback. We'd love to see if you like this content. So there'll be a 10-second survey at the end of the session, and then we will send the slides, the recording, as well as the final CPO report to all the attendees afterwards. So you don't have to worry about that should you want it. Okay, so I thought it would be interesting for us to just to spend the time sort of digging into the motivating hypothesis in terms of why Jeremy and I kicked this off. And so, as mentioned, this research started after we both left Shutterstock, and that was a 7-8 year journey building product together, learning a ton, making a bunch of mistakes. And one of the things we realized was it was really hard to get the product team at both companies to really be forward thinking in terms of new opportunities. And I wasn't sure if that was a function of the vertical that we were servicing. So we were selling into marketers, which tends to be relatively abstract to a non-marketer, but it just seemed like a big obstacle to get the product people to spend more and more time with customers to develop their own unique hypothesis as opposed to responding to other teams. And so one of the books that really inspired this that we both were reading was this book on creativity, and it's this really old book from 1926. That's still heavily referenced today, and it's actually the first complete model of the creative process. And so the reason this resonated with me is it was as we were thinking about the product management process, which is very, very different depending on who you talk to. It was interesting to contrast the two. So the creative process, as articulated in The Art of Thought, breaks down the process into 4 stages. So the first stage is preparation, and this is where you're doing your sort of deep research, your information gathering, you're thinking about the problem, but you haven't really come to a conclusion. The second stage is incubation, where you're actually not even thinking about the problem at all. You're setting it aside and sleeping, walking, going on vacation, working on other projects, and your subconscious brain is starting to make all of these associations that you are just not aware of, but it's like such an important part of the creative process. That leads to illumination, which is your aha moment where you see the solution for the first time, and this is the washing your hair in the shower, and you get an idea. That's a byproduct of those first 2 steps, and then of course the verification where you go out and refining your idea. And so when you read this and then you compare that to how you run product, it's interesting to see the difference. And what I've experienced is we spend a lot more time on the back half of that creative process and less time up front, which is obviously going to have some side effects later on down the road in terms of the creativity that comes out of that. And so we kicked off this research with this in mind. In terms of the report approach, so as mentioned, this is ad hoc. We are informal. We don't represent an organization. So over the last few months, March and April, coincidentally, when COVID was apparently a big thing, we spent a lot of time reaching out to people, both in our network and outside our network, to have conversations with, chief product officers and heads of product. We ended up connecting with much more than our goal of 50, 81 participants in total from across the U.S. and Europe. 65 were heads of product and 16 were heads of sales. We included the heads of sales midway through the research because we realized that we wanted to hear both sides of the story, and I'm really glad we did. Our focus has been on B2B software. We did chat with a few B2C people, but for the bulk of it was B2B. And I think B2B is unique in the sense that the people building product may not necessarily be doing the job, so it can add some additional challenges. And then in terms of the format, there were short 30-minute interviews, qualitative interviews, where we were trying to assess head of product's priorities, their workflow to achieve those priorities, what challenges they were facing, and then implications of those challenges. And so we were just more like a fact-finding mission, and then we grouped the challenges together based on some thematics that we inferred, and then there turned out to be 3 big ones. And so those are the ones that we're going after today. And we don't have recommendations on how to fix a lot of these challenges, but again, that's hopefully what the panel will surface a little bit, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion around it. Okay, let's get into it. So the first theme is really something that I touched on earlier, is deeply understanding the customer. And so if you think of both the product organization and the non-product organization, they're going to touch customers and communicate with customers in very, very different ways. And they will, of course, have a different perspective on what the customer problems are and which ones are the most urgent to solve. One of the things that becomes clear that is if the product team doesn't become the most knowledgeable team with regards to the customer, they inevitably revert into a delivery function. And so if they're not bringing new insight, new learning to the table frequently, they become very, very dependent on other organizations to do that. And of course, especially in the B2B space, this can be very challenging because, like, for example, if you're building product for marketers and you yourself are not a marketer, you're going to have to spend a lot of time in the customer's head to try to understand their challenges. And if you're not able to do that, it's going to create a gap. If the product team isn't able to do that, some other team generally picks up the load, which again sort of changes the dynamic of that product group. So there was a bunch of quotes that we pulled out of the report. Here are some of the consistent ones where you've got commercial teams complaining about the product's knowledge of the market by not being able to identify competitors. PMs seem much more like project managers or order takers, not really bringing anything unique to the table. This is especially true in very technical products where they're building products like developers, and the developers are very, very familiar with the solution and the problem. PMs need to spend a lot of time adding value there. And then a sort of current, a pretty common, I don't know what the word is, but defense of not spending enough time with customers is PMs just don't have enough time because they spend so much time clarifying requests. But if they had incremental time, they would go spend some customers. And so this obviously is going to become a real problem. Some high-level symptoms, PMs, of course, spending all their time triaging, and if you actually count, how many customer conversations per week that they have, it's relatively low. Priorities changing very frequently is a big one as well, and so that actually goes back to the creative process I mentioned. If your hypothesis and thesis aren't grounded in deep research and they're grounded only by anecdotes, for example, we need X feature to close this $3 million deal. If those factors change, your priorities will likely change. And of course, that's not really good for anyone. You've got sales, CSM, and exec driving the roadmap, lots of cross-functional meetings. And then generally the sentiment appears to be quite low morale, both within the product team and then between those two the product and non-product organizations. So a big bulk of the conversations we had with heads of product revolved around this. The second theme is an interesting one. It's really curating the why. So one interesting anecdote that came out is that this is what actually triggered the conversation with heads of sales. Is the product team would inevitably complain about commercial people saying, all salespeople do is bring me feature requests, and I have to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out what the problem actually is. When we went and talked to the commercial side of the house and the sales and the client success people, they actually said the exact same thing, but in a different way, that the product team is releasing features and roadmaps, but not actually articulating the problem that they solve. And so if you're a product person, a non-product person in the technology space, regardless of your role, you're curious, you're interested in technology, and if the product team isn't giving you context in terms of the outcome and the customer and the customer segment that they're actually building solution for, you have to connect the dots, and sometimes that can be really, really hard. Some interesting quotes here, sort of the two in particular that I resonated with me the most was this notion of like an empty suit salesperson or CSM not really understanding the value of the product. And so if you can't see the problem that the product is solving, all you're really doing is pitching features, and that makes you as a salesperson much less effective because you can't map the features to the problem that the customer's having. And then the middle one actually was the most interesting, which hopefully we can talk through a bit later with Tyler, is that if the salespeople don't understand the problem that it's solving for a particular customer and a customer segment, by no fault of their own, they tend to overpromise what the product can do or what potentially can be delivered, which of course is in nobody's best interest. And then when product team is releasing features, how are they actually communicating that internally as more of like an enablement function to make sure people get it? Some symptoms in your org that you can look for is like, how is your product team releasing features? Is it a list of features on a spreadsheet or an email, or are you layering in customer stories and examples of how customers would use it in the wild? Again, lots of tension between sales team over-promising because they don't understand what the product actually is. And then if you walk the floor and ask people what the last release was, most people can't remember. That's obviously not an ideal situation. And then if you sort of think about the culture between those teams, if the sales and the client success organization doesn't understand how product releases impact their customer, there's going to be a lot of tension because those commercial teams are obviously highly incented on quotas and retention. And if they can't connect the dots, that'll be a big problem. And then finally, the final theme here is showcasing the supply and demand. And so if you think of sort of the heads of product in their role, obviously a big part of it is building the product, but another big part of it is making sure that all the non-product team understand all the demands on product and why they are doing what they are doing and why. And if you look at, for example, just the individual releases, that only tells a very small part of the story. And if you're not able to showcase the rest of the demands put on the product team, they will inevitably jump to conclusions around efficiency and productivity. And so some quotes that surfaced this theme were things like, if I'm running product, how do I connect the roadmap specifically to the overall objectives? So the vision of the company, the mission of the company, the business and corporate objectives, all the way down to the roadmap, but do it in a way that non-technical people with no product background can understand. This next one is interesting. This is something I saw a lot at Shutterstock, where if people don't understand how product impacts the overall objectives, they start to view the product purely as a group that needs to be as efficient as possible. And so when there's a general misunderstanding or unclear what product is doing, they focus on things like, are the product team showing up to the office before 8:30? Are they hitting their release dates? All the things that may or may not even matter to the outcome. That's something that obviously we want to avoid. And then the last one is more on the ability for anyone to read the sort of corporate strategy and then really correlate that through the product to the individual feature as an ultimate goal. In terms of symptoms, sort of touched on these already. Productivity is a big one. That's a big red flag. If you walk around the floor and ask people where they get their product information, if they can't find it, that's a problem. And then, another way to check is, walk up to someone outside of product and ask them what the product strategy is. And if they can't articulate it consistently, then you guys have your work cut out for you. So those are the big three themes that came out. And so I didn't touch on any of the solutions that came up, but what I'd like to do now is move over to our panel. So how do I do this here? Jeremy, are you able to unmute Sue, Tyler, and Jim?
Yep, sure can.
I'm unmuted.
Oh, hey, Jim.
Hi, Grant.
Tyler, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, Sue, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, awesome. So thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. Just for context for everyone else. So as mentioned, we were doing a bunch of interviews, and I had the privilege to speak with both all three, Sue, Tyler, and Jim on some of these subjects. And I invited them to join this roundtable, and they graciously accepted. So thank you very much. So maybe first we can just do a round of intros, starting with Sue.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue. I lead product at DataCamp. DataCamp is an e-learning platform that focuses on learning by doing. So you can kind of imagine it as bite-sized learning. So you watch like a video for like 3 minutes and it goes straight into coding within the platform, and it gives you real-time feedback when you do something wrong and when you do something right. So I've been at DataCamp for a year plus now, and I'm currently based in the UK, but the company's headquarters are in New York. Nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Sue.
Nice to meet you.
Tyler?
Absolutely. My name is Tyler Brock. I'm based here in New York, actually about a block away from DataCamp's New York headquarters, coincidentally. I lead a commercial function that is comprised of sales, customer success, professional services, but also to work very closely with our product management function, which is based out of our headquarters in the UK. Locate is a location intelligence tool. So it's simply put, when you're going through the checkout experience on a retail site, Nike and eBay being some examples of clients, and you're going to check out, we're simply the address function on their site that within a few keystrokes is pulling back an address. And on the back end, that simple action, as simple as it sounds, drives tens of millions of dollars in savings for them as it relates to failed shipments. But it's great to be here. Thanks again for having me. Grant and Jeremy, and looking forward to the roundtable.
Awesome. And Jim, finally.
Yeah, so I'm Jim Banister, the CPO at the product chief at Raisin. Raisin is a pan-European and soon in the United States, started as a savings marketplace. So think of it as savings as a service, where we match anybody in the EU region with the best fixed term deposit anywhere else in the EU, which was not possible before. We have something approaching 11 billion assets under management now, and it's growing like a weed, which is pretty good. And we're entering in the US market later this year.
Amazing, thank you. I've never run a virtual roundtable, so in terms of format, and everyone, both Sue, Tyler, and Jim are learning this as well. Some of the themes that we talked about on the individual calls, I'm going to bring up, and then so I'll kind of go through each one of you around the particular theme I've picked you for, and then I have some general questions for the group, and then we can move to take audience participant questions. So I'll start with Sue. So Sue, based in the UK, although I think you originally from the US, correct?
Right, I moved from New York a year and a half ago for this role.
For this role, nice. So last time we spoke, you mentioned that you and your product org recently shifted to not talk about features unless you have sort of the why in the segment, and you told this really great story around how you kind of came into that org and noticed some things and made some changes. Is it possible for you to provide some context on that?
Yeah, sure. So I joined DataCamp a year plus ago, and I think basically where we're at is the awkward teenage phase of, trying to scale up from a startup and trying to become a professional B2B company. So I would say that we are also very, very much a skeleton crew. So trying to do as much as like an IPO'd company with limited resources is definitely a challenge. I would say that when I first came in, we were still very much feature driven. So, there's a lot of ideas coming from the founders and from the CS team and so on to be like, we need this. And because the teams are just so, to your point earlier, so overwhelmed with work, with the day-to-day stuff, meetings, presentations, just, letting everyone know what they're working on, there was not enough emphasis on product research. And I myself was guilty of that too, because you just constantly have deadlines and things to do that you kind of forget the bigger picture. What changed though was I went on parental leave for 3 months and I came back and it was just so clear to me what was wrong. And it was just one of those things that sometimes, to your point on incubation, you just need to like step away and look at yourself and realize what the problems were. And so
did you notice before you left that there were such problems, or was it something that your conclusion came when you actually stepped away from the office?
You always know that at the back of your mind, but you just kind of like push it away because there's just like something else to worry about. But what has changed though is then I actually got everyone to do pragmatic marketing, and Pragmatic Institute is what they're called now for training. And the whole training is just focusing on the problem, on the user problem, and lots of examples of like how when you do feature specific delivery, it just becomes the worst thing ever. And if you focus more on a problem, it doesn't have to be the fanciest solution. But if you solve the use case, it actually does go very far. So spending most of your time on problem discovery and problem validation and solutions are easy to do. And I think that's a problem where we were facing, is because we had too many solutions. Like we're so excited. There's so many ideas. It's like, oh, this is one problem. Here's 10 possible solutions. And it's finding out what solution to do that takes a lot of time, right? And people are constantly questioning PMs, like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And when you can't defend yourself because you didn't do enough discovery, what can you say, right? So
I think you described like contrasting, like one of your monthly product updates where you showed the roadmap and the product team just got destroyed as an example of what you're describing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you can't defend yourself because you're like, oh, we heard this. And you're like,
right, maybe
that's true. I mean, I didn't hear that, so that's what happens when you don't do enough problem discovery. And that's also what happens, to your point. Like if you don't know your users enough, the leaders, the founders, CS teams are going to tell you what features to build. And you can't really defend yourself and why you don't want to do that. And so And then we dug deeper to figure out like why we can't do more of this, and it's due to time. And one of our PMs
where was everyone spending time? Because this is something that comes up a lot. Is we've got a huge backlog of stuff already. We don't need more stuff, so we're not going to go do research. Where did you find your PMs could carve out the most time?
I would say this is still work in progress, right? So I just got back in Q2 of this year. But the big thing we did was we realized that a lot of the time was focused on communication and keeping everyone involved. So everyone really cares. And everyone, you know, to make a successful product, you need content, you need CS, you need all these different departments. But you can't just run around like a headless chicken trying to make sure that every person in content knows exactly what you're working on because it touches one piece of their area. And you can do presentations, but not everyone would listen to every presentation. To your point, like understanding the whys. So one thing we did there in terms of improving the process is to introduce the liaison model. So having squad liaisons, which are basically representatives from each department, be part of the squad. So you can think of it as like a perpetual task force. And what happens is whenever the content team has a question on what the squad is working on, they don't have to go to the PM and ping them, and because every ping is like 20 minutes on the PM's time. They go to the squad liaison, and the squad liaison basically is the representative voice for their whole department. So they come to all the brainstorming, they talk about the problems, and they come up with the solutions and the roadmap discussions together as a new squad. And so they give their voice. And so whenever people are like, well, why wasn't I consulted in, you know, figuring out the solution for this problem? The response now is like, well, you can talk to your liaison because they actually were part of that discussion. And that actually saved a lot of time from the PM's book. So what has happened, and we're still trying to figure out how to make it even better, but what has happened is now we actually are able to spend more time on user interviews. I'm seeing that like constantly we are able to defend our roadmap. And for the Q3 roadmap, we were actually able to show a roadmap, and for every question people asked, we were able to tell them why with numbers and anecdotes, which was far different from where we were a quarter ago.
So you freed up some time on your PMs by sort of offloading that extra sort of administrative work, alignment work to a cross-functional team. And then did you incent your product people to go and do more customer interviews, or did they do that naturally?
It was part of the OKRs to have at least 5 user interviews per sprint. Yeah.
And then they present.
But there was also another thing.
Go ahead, sorry.
There was also another thing because we are obviously cost is important. So we're like, every user interview right now is expensive. So you have to make sure that you don't ask something that someone else has already done before. So like introducing processes to like quickly discover what was asked before, and making sure that every new user interview is, you know, has a goal and is, adding value.
Yeah. And then so when you're representing the roadmap in this format, the focus of the conversation with the rest of the company really shifts, you mentioned?
Yeah, so now you're right. I forgot to mention that. So now actually, to keep ourselves accountable, we've been we keep driving the importance of doing, you know, focusing on user. And I did a lot of those presentations in the company. And now we actually get held accountable in a different way, where they're like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Like, what are the goals of this feature? And those are the kind of questions you want to get asked, right? So so now the whole company is keeping us accountable, which is fine, and that's good.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for sharing that story. Tyler, we chatted, you've got a really interesting scenario in the sense that your product team is entirely based in the UK, and it's a pretty small product team relative to the amount of commercial people on your team. I love how you sort of talk through some of those challenges. Could you share some of those challenges with the group?
Yeah, happy to do so. And I think that, you know, I think the analogy I used for when we were talking was our company's kind of disproportionate in the same way that if you go to the gym and there's maybe someone at the gym who just works out their upper body but doesn't work out their legs, look kind of unbalanced, right? They have these big arms, and then their legs are tiny. Like that's our team. You know, our commercial team is the big arms and chest, and then our product team are the skinny legs because as a business, we haven't invested nearly enough into product, into building it up into the what it could and should be. And into your question, which was, what are the implications of that? I think there's a number, right? I think the first thing you hit on is probably one of the biggest things, which is there's not enough people to really get into the weeds of our customer stories and the why of why people are picking us, or even just who our competitors are. So then it becomes a case where that kind of early discovery process is essentially done by sales and CSMs, which is fine. They're or not fine. It's one way to do it. They're closer to customers, but at the same time, what you're going to get is, the way we're wired to work is very much challenge solution. So that generates a long, list of features. It doesn't generate a product vision though. It's just, kind of playing whack-a-mole, if you will. Whereas if we had product involved and product owning that and having the capacity to really do that discovery, well, in that case, right, they're really building a product vision around the answers they're hearing from talking to our customers in the field. So I think that's one. The second one is that, when you kind of have a thin product function as we do, the communication inevitably, falls off. And I feel for them, right? They're trying to support, this massive or a pretty large commercial team. I'm sure they're getting all sorts of requests. And as Sue called out, right, one ping can be 20 minutes. And so what you get is that feedback loop becomes even weaker. And at the same time, there's a lower, the commercial teams don't understand what the product is supposed to do or the why behind it nearly as well. And I think it leads to more cases of overselling, right? I know there's, among product people, the thought may be that we're intentionally overselling. I promise it's not the case as sellers and CSMs. And sometimes, you have a wayward seller or whatever it may be. But more often than not, it's just that the reps don't fundamentally understand what the product is supposed to do. And so when I think of the implications as you laid them out, that's one of the big ones for us, is that our team doesn't have a clear understanding or understanding not just our product roadmap, but also the specifics of how a feature is supposed to work. And I think one of the best ways to communicate that, as we kind of talk through, is just through stories. Taking it from this feature does these, matches these specs, to putting it, enlivening it, and describing how it looks or how it would look in a specific customer scenario, or how it's worked in a beta. Because those sorts of stories, people ingest information best through stories, in my view at least, so it's more likely that it's being ingested by the commercial team. But I think you have to keep in mind with the commercial team that, really strong sellers, I look at it as, a good sales pitch is really just kind of a collection of really good stories. And so when you have, an amazing product team that's really in the weeds of understanding the why, and it's kind of relaying those customer stories, that just makes the commercial team that much more effective. And I think the flip side of that doesn't exist is that, the best commercial people in my eyes, usually the ones that are the most attuned to the product. And they want to know the why. They're fundamentally really curious people. And so they do get they can become a little bit less engaged when they don't have that depth of understanding. And they don't understand what the why is, and also makes them less effective in the field because when you're selling, you really need to be able to tell that story in a compelling and passionate way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the sort of the two things stand out is, so the ratio of your company of a small sales team with lots of sales reps, like having built a sort of high growth startup myself, that's a really easy trap to fall into, where you just add a few more salespeople and the revenue goes up, and then you have a few more salespeople and the revenue keeps going up. But at some point it breaks, and sort of building out the scalability aspect of it and resourcing the product team to support the sales team and not just sort of plunk in a marketing or sales enablement person is really, really critical. But it's like a really slippery slope, because you've got a direct revenue generating resource in a sales head versus like an incremental product person where there isn't that clear path. And so it's like the founder has to make some really, really hard decisions. And I think the other thing that I want to call out, just so everyone is really clear, because this was a big learning for me. So you mentioned the average salesperson who works for a tech startup is very curious, very forward thinking, and not your sort of typical enterprise coin operated salesperson. And so when they oversell, it's not a function that they're just quoted and they've got the wrong incentive and they're don't care. It's because they fundamentally don't know the barriers, and that's not necessarily their fault. It's the organization, and in particular, if it's a product sale, it's a product organization that really has to rectify that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one nuance to it, the way I'd put it is actually when you said enterprise, I actually would say that on the enterprise you're gonna find even more of that genuine curiosity. I think that sometimes at least in my view, in where you find more of the coin operated mentality can sometimes be with lower transaction sizes, where it's a lot more I have to close 5 or 6 deals today to be on track for my quota. So I think I think absolutely you do find in that this transition, at least as I've seen in the past 10, 15 years, of people of a different types of sellers coming into the org from different types of backgrounds, right? You're getting a lot of people coming from investment banking backgrounds, consulting backgrounds, whereas I think 20, 30 years ago, the typical kind of breeding grounds of sellers was very different. Totally. Was kind of empty suit sales, but it's made the profession, in my eyes at least, a far stronger one, more intellectual one, more rigorous one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, last but not least, so when we chatted,
maybe it's least.
Yeah, thank you for joining. I know you had a packed day. So when we chatted a couple times. You were describing how you were brought in, by the founders of Raisin as they transition from sort of a small company where everyone's name to a large company where that's not really possible. What were some of the things that you put into place, and what continues or was really hard about that?
Yeah, am I allowed to share screen?
Oh, I think so. Jeremy,
yeah,
is that possible?
I can. Well, I'll share I'll try and pack this into 5 minutes. I'll share 2 pieces of context. The first is that Raisin, as Grant was alluding to, was transitioning from a quite small company where everybody's in one room, and now we're, and osmosis was going on, to a bigger one where it didn't work anymore, what they were doing. And the transition also included this, I guess I would say, the concept of build what we sell versus sell what we've built. And that's pretty profound when you're, enterprise or sales, because we have a business to business and a business to consumer, and actually a business to consumer aspect of our business. And so that was quite challenging. So we started out sort of like a financial services company, more like American Express, where technology and quote unquote product at the time, which was more project management, not product management, was like fulfilling the promise of the business, and sort of a technology was a slave to the master of what we could sell to customers. And the ambition was to, and continues to be, to move to a true SaaS platform, which is a thing that's in progress. And the second thing I would share is, in the kindest, most compassionate way, the founders would admit, I don't know what product is, but it's inefficient. That's what they literally, they would say that in the most compassionate way. And so there was just a disconnect, across the board. And so if I could share, I'll just share a couple. I said I can't share screen while you're sharing, Grant. So if you could unshare for a moment.
Yep.
I can share really quickly. So one of the things that I tried to do, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but everybody's got their own mental model in their head of, up here in the upper right is purpose, company vision, company mission. And, I put in North Star and Southern Cross because we have people from the Southern Hemisphere. So we're being politically correct in terms of making sure that they know which direction they're going. Strategy and the tactics to fulfill those, the roadmap itself, sprints, backlog, and then you have these sort of product principles. And every one of us has some subset or some structure like this. And then at the top, you have the company chat, the cascading OKRs, if you're using OKRs or some, KPIs at the top. And then at the bottom, you have these ways of working that purportedly will fulfill these things, right? And so putting all that together is challenging. And there's no single product that delivers on this. You have to sort of cobble it together in terms of methodologies and ways of working and the tools that you use and so forth. And so one of the first things I actually did was I went up here when I first came in to say, in the purpose and company vision, I actually created a video for the whole company. Before I created it, I curated everything I could hear, and I put it back in a video form and said, guys, is this what we're talking about? Is this what we're doing? The founders, to make sure it was there. And then I did the same thing at every single level down to, so I curated before I created, I guess I would say. And then what ended up happening is there was this disconnect, and this leads to the theme that Grant was referring to, is there was a disconnect between all the demand for these things based on the purpose and the vision and our strategy and what we could actually do. And so I spent a load of time, actually, I'll just show you one graphic here, a load of time sort of helping people understand the realities of who we were, right? So everybody has a version of this, right? We have more squads than this today. This was, I don't know, 8 months ago when I did this, which was every single individual squad has a certain capacity and a certain capability. And then you have this histogram of demand above, which is, I need this, I need this, I need this, across customer service and marketing and the business teams and different product, the product business teams, because you have different business teams for different product lines, et cetera. And figuring out how to map that was super challenging. And that's one of the things that turned out to be one of the root causes for the founders to say, I don't know what product is, but we become more inefficient over time. And so I'll share one last visual for you, which is this technique that we use called capacity planning, which is precisely developed, and it's a pseudo-agile technique. And the way I liken it is to, anybody ever seen Forrest Gump, right? You remember his leg braces, when you put on the leg braces and then it's like, run, Forrest, run. They're throwing rocks at him and he starts sprinting and then the leg braces come flying off. That's what capacity planning is that eventually you don't need it anymore, but it is something that forces the company. So if you look at across the top here, you see every single one of the squads. And then we actually do an analysis of what capacity they have available, right? And every quarter, how many holidays are there, et cetera, how many historical incidents or unplanned work come in, and we allocate for that. And then every single initiative coming from every part of the company comes here, and it forces these conversations to make sure that we're actually talking about what is it you want to do, how do we do that? And the teams are going, well, we use swagging, different than estimating. So sweet wild ass guesses and estimating are different things entirely. And then we actually look at all the cross squad dependencies. You'll see some have they're totally independent to an individual squad, and other ones have cross squad or cross business dependencies. And we map that all out. And that takes us a few days essentially. And then within the envelope of capacity planning, we actually allow the squads to be agile based on what they learn, what they discover, et cetera, so they can fully deprecate an initiative, or they can add a new one, or they can change the scope of it. And then we have program management involved in making sure that signal is moving through the organism. So those are my initial comments.
Interesting. So when you presented that to, I guess to the founder, so you mentioned the two things were build what we sell, not sell what we build, and the view as the organization is efficient. Did that help? Inefficient, sorry. Did that help? And the reason I ask is, so I've sort of sat at a sort of CEO level with a product team where I had the same thing, where it's like, these product teams rolling in at 10 a.m. and I'm not seeing stuff being delivered. It feels inefficient to me. And then you press the head of product, and they inevitably give you a list of stuff they have to do, maintenance, bug features. Like, how did you help the head of product the CEO rationalize that and feel like the product team is actually doing the right thing? Because when you show me a big graph of this is all the maintenance stuff, to me, in my head, that's not necessarily high value. How do you connect the dots for that person?
I mean, the metaphor for me is holding up the mirror, right? Just helping them see is the first step. And that helped, right? So it's frustrating. They don't want to talk about that level of detail necessarily. And it's a real thing, right? So it's one of these things where it's super easy for a founder, certainly, to compartmentalize context. Mm-hmm. It's super easy for all of us as humans to do that, right? Say, well, yeah, but that's not important. This is what's important. And I would say that that it was super challenging at the beginning and much less challenging now. We literally had a town hall 1 year. I'm 1 year in, and we had a town hall just before this meeting, and our CEO was speaking about how we do prioritization and how, he was leading with this. We have better visibility now into what we do and why we prioritize these things, because we can see it. And if we can't see it, you can't fix it, right? It's the same, as if you can't measure it, right? You can't, there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah.
Do you take that one level down in terms of looking at the efficiency of the engineering team to build cleaner code so there's less maintenance required? Like, has this exposed any other conversations that are now happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that it's like, anybody done rolfing or structural integration, where you start doing this deep tissue stuff where you on the body, and then you're like, oh, you got a pain here, and then you start going deeper and deeper, and it reveals other injuries, like old injuries. So there's been this layering. It's unveiled these things, like what you're saying is there were invisible challenges within individual squads. We didn't know about those. We didn't start by saying you need to hit this many story points and that kind of thing. That's not a thing, right? That's an outcome. That's not an input. And so yes, it absolutely, every time we unpeeled a layer of visibility and discussion, it revealed another layer of challenge. And so we're still working on those things. Some teams are healthier than others. It's just the way it works. Yeah.
Yeah. So switching gears a bit, this is a question for the group. So that I sort of kicked off this research with this assumption that, product teams, as product management as a discipline is too delivery and executionally focused, and there's not enough room for creativity. I'm obviously biased by that, because when I'm looking to start a new company from scratch, it's all greenfield, it's all opportunity. But when you have to manage an existing subscriber base, obviously your challenges are different. Do you guys as a group feel that product teams are too delivery focused, and as a function in terms of the training that's available, the background that people have, that it is headed in the right direction? Or do you feel that there will be an evolution and a push of almost like splitting out those skills of maintaining the complexity that you just showed, Jim, with like, how do you actually become a creative professional and think of new novel solutions?
Is that a question for the audience?
This question for the three roundtable participants.
Oh,
cool.
I'll defer.
Yeah.
Tyler, Sue?
Sue, Tyler, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that it's kind of to the point you're making. Like, I think that within our organization, structurally, we just don't really have that muscle that embeds or that we as an org just don't function in that way where we have product properly embedded. We know we need to fix that, because at the end of the day, what happens when you don't have product and they have the bandwidth to be a part of that early stage discovery process and in those conversations, is you have kind of the case where we're in, where sales and CSM are dictating it, and it becomes this kind of feature kind of it's a band-aid for this client request, a band-aid for that client request, and it's not a true product vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So this is, like, as a side note, I'm running another.
Can I just share a real quick observation?
Oh, yeah.
So personally, I'm just a guy. What do I know? Personally, what I found is that as a product dude, that treating the product as your product and the team as your product discreetly is a super valuable distinction. Meaning that so for me, my product is not our product. My product is my team's. And I use the same techniques that I expect of the teams to evolve the teams to do precisely what Tyler was talking about, which is, I think what I heard you say, Tyler, which is how do you incrementally improve the team and the butt weight, if you will, of that team within the larger organization, if it's a new function within that team and as it's evolving. And they are different problems to solve. So if you actually create OKRs and epics, or initiatives and epics that are related specifically to evolving the team, that's your product, if you're a product leader, in my opinion. And it's a very useful mindset.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the social engineering. Sorry, Sue, go ahead. Go ahead, Sue.
No, I'm just going to add that I think I really like that mindset of thinking of the team as a product, because I do think that basically thinking about the overall output for the company is the product, and how do you get to the output? It's your team. And, high performing team, like, morale boosting, all those things. What causes low morale is when people don't have ownership, and all the symptoms that were discussed previously, all are problems that, you want to solve. high performing team. So I love that. I just wanted to say that analogy.
Yeah, I think the team was interesting. So the other thing that's come up in these discussions is there's no really one background for the right product person. It seems like as the field evolves, people's backgrounds evolve as well. What is the one thing that you guys are seeing that the product team, the individuals, the people, the humans need the most help with from their leadership to be successful in that function?
I'll defer.
From what I can tell, it's really about being an advocate for what they need and, removing roadblocks. So, I mean, there's multiple things as well, I'm sure, but basically, especially if you're trying to change the culture of a company to become more, problem focused, I think the biggest thing that a CPO or head of product can do at that point is to educate everyone else, including founders and sales teams and everybody, about why the process is the way it is, what happens when it's not like this, and actually tying it to real outcomes and consequences, and building that culture that enables your product team to do those things is probably one big one I can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Tyler?
Yeah, I found that.
Oh, sorry.
Tyler, go ahead.
So I think, for me, I obviously have a lot less experience with actual product people compared to I'm sorry, I just melted your names together, Jim and Sue.
Sue, we're like, that's funny.
But the one thing that comes to mind, at least from a commercial perspective, that at least I've seen in really great product managers, is that they're fantastic listeners. And they're also incredibly curious at getting to the why. They don't just take the first explanation from the client as being, oh, well, this is what we need to go develop. It's really getting to that kind of root nerve, which it sounds simple, but I think it's a lot harder to develop than I think a lot of people realize.
Mm-hmm.
I would add precisely what Tyler said. Curiosity is a great trait, and I would say whether it's a product leader or a product manager. I would also say that giving them emotional safety combined with really increasingly good context, making sure I actually talked to I think I have 13 product owners. I think I have 13 product owners. I haven't counted them. They're like children. I can't remember all their names. But I talk to them as a Hive CPO. I speak to them as if you will be a CPO someday. So I don't know the right answer. Let's figure out the right answer. So get them in that space, in that context, to help them make better decisions has been super valuable, and they take it, which is great.
I open up to any questions. We've got a few minutes left, so if there are any questions from the group or any questions from the panel that we want to discuss, happy to do that.
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of questions that we've gotten in the chat. I'll just start listing the first one. First question is, curious that we all agree research is so important, but product teams are typically such a small proportion of the overall organization. Have folks seen success with aligning research activity across the org to help scale research efforts? That's a question for
Great
everybody.
question.
I can
go ahead, Sue. Yeah.
So we do actually ask engineers and content folks to do some of that research. Sales teams also do this research, and we have a Slack channel to basically put all the research findings from sales into that. One of the things to be conscious of, though, is that you would have to make sure that everyone is educated on how to run a good user interview. Because if you have sales teams doing the user research, basically they are obviously everyone's incentives are different, and you may be kind of more conscious about what would close this deal or what would renew this deal, as opposed to what's a solution that would be scalable and reusable and is the best thing for the company. Making sure you ask questions in a non-biased way and so on. So I think those are things that sometimes it's okay to delegate, and we've been trying to do that with engineers and content teams and sometimes sales, but always making sure that you educate them on how to run an unbiased interview is important.
Actually, there was another question actually specific for you, Sue, but they asked, how do you measure if a user interview was useful or not?
That's a good question. Well, I think that basically we actually go back to, so one example, we don't have a good quantitative measure, I would say. What is measurable though is the problem solution fit after something's released. So I think like basically at every product weekly meeting right now, we do kind of talk about all the user interviews we did so that, you know, everyone can understand like what the user feedback was for different parts of the product. And people do ask those questions to keep everyone accountable, to be like, how was this different from the past user interview? What was the new thing that you found out? And so kind of like having the accountability and the usefulness kind of surfaced in the group setting is how we measure that. And also we showed a different iteration. So right now we're going through a solution iteration of using user interviews to be like, here's a design, do you understand what this means? And then iterating based on those things, people can actually see that difference between iteration 1 and iteration 5, as opposed to what happened like 2 quarters ago. It would have been just been the first iteration out because we just don't have enough time. And you can see that difference in that iteration, which is hard to measure because like, you know, you only can see that in hindsight. But it was very clear to everybody how much better that additional agile iteration changed the solution.
Awesome. I think we're running out of time, but I want to pose one more question just to the group, and then we'll wrap up. But I thought this question was quite interesting. So how does the panel feel about this particular statement, and how do you work around this dilemma? Product management has a lot of responsibility, but often has little authority to actually get things done. What techniques do you use to get through this?
I'll defer to Jim or Tyler, since I've been speaking a lot.
You want to give it a go, Tyler?
Sure. I mean, the long short of it is I don't have a great answer. I think that we definitely suffer from that problem where the final authority sits with commercial as far as the roadmap, which I think is the exact wrong approach. We're still kind of in that process of really empowering product and making them, you know, I look at it as just one big kind of virtuous loop with different stakeholders. I don't think it should be dictated just because by commercial, just because revenue is coming in through the commercial stream. So I think the short answer of that is I'm not quite sure, but it's something that we're working on too, as far as empowering product and giving them equal authority at the table.
I think I have a short answer. Let me give it a go. I don't know if it's the right answer, but it's a short answer-ish. One is charm offensive. Be compassionate and curious, and truly compassionate and curious. If you can really find it in your heart to really be listening, they'll know, right? And so they'll start giving that a wee bit of benefit of the doubt. And the second is always think of it as a systemic problem to solve over time. There's just no way to do, in my experience, to do that, you know, as a quick fix. And so just think about the vector, the direction of the vector, and increasing the magnitude of that vector of improvement and trust. It will come out of that over time, quarter to month, quarter to quarter, you know, 6 months to 6 months. And before you know it, the curve looks like this. It becomes an exponential curve. So if you look at it as a incremental returns problem, then it's more manageable. And that's been my experience in terms of building more trust and yeah, that wasn't very short. Better, never best.
Sue, any last comments?
No, I think that basically just making sure that you understand the whys and explain the whys and talk about like what's best for the company. So if people, you know, if you don't have authority, basically being like, this is what is best for the company, and being open to what Jim was saying, open to changing our mind. And having everyone rally around the same goals is a good way to do that.
So we're out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, in particular the panelists, for joining and sharing your knowledge with all of us. There is a short survey in the chat. If you could just please fill that out. It'll take literally 10 seconds. Appreciate the effort. And we'll send all the material out. And huge thanks for everyone who participated. And hopefully this was valuable for you all. And have a great rest of the week and a great rest of the day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
No, bye.